The dust of Redemption Creek was a fine, pale powder that settled on everything, a shroud for the living and the dead. It coated the raw timber of the saloon, the warped boards of the general store, and the 3 small figures tied to the back of a freight wagon. They were girls, children really, though the oldest carried an age in her eyes that had nothing to do with years. Their hands were bound with coarse rope that had rubbed their wrists raw. They were barefoot, their feet bruised and stained by the long road. Their dark hair was matted with grime, their clothes little more than thin, frayed rags that did little to ward off the mean little wind that worried the edges of the town. They were Chinese, a detail that made them as foreign and unwelcome as a winter blight in summer. The townspeople stared. Some from the shaded cover of doorways, others in the open, their faces hard and curious. Women clutched their children's hands a little tighter. Men spat tobacco juice into the dirt, their gazes lingering with a mix of pity and contempt. The girls did not look back. The 2 younger ones, barely more than toddlers, huddled against their older sister, their faces buried in the folds of her ragged tunic. She was a thin reed of a girl, but she stood as straight as a fence post, her chin held level. She stared at a point just past the town, at the heat shimmering above the endless, sun-scorched plains. Her stillness was a wall, her silence a fortress around the trembling fear of her sisters. A man named Barlow owned the wagon. He was broad and florid, his face a map of broken veins. He gestured at the girls with a sweep of his hand as if presenting livestock at a fair. Payment, he boomed, his voice thick with whiskey and self-satisfaction. For a debt owed by a rail splitter who had nothing left to his name but these 3. Hardly a fair trade, but a man takes what he can get. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of a sign swinging in the wind and the soft, whimpering sound one of the younger girls could not hold back. The oldest girl's shoulder flinched, a tiny, sharp movement as she pressed her sister closer. She did not look at Barlow. She did not look at the crowd. To look was to acknowledge, and to acknowledge was to break. From the edge of the small crowd, leaning against the hitching post in front of the smithy, a man watched. His name was Elias Miller. The dust of the land clung to him not like a temporary coating, but as if it were part of his skin, settled deep in the lines around his eyes and the creases of his neck. He wore a worn duster that had seen too many seasons and boots that were cracked and resoled. He was a man who had made a home in isolation, his face weathered into a mask of quiet endurance. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that few in the town could guess at, though they all knew he was a widower who kept to himself on a failing patch of land miles from anyone else. He watched the scene unfold, his expression unchanging. He saw the raw, chafed skin on the girl's wrists. He saw the defiant set of her jaw. He saw the terror in the way the little ones clung to her, like saplings to a mother tree in a storm. He had seen men treat animals with more decency. The sight settled in his gut like a cold stone. Barlow, getting no offers of praise or sympathy, grew impatient. Well, they're no use to me. I need cash for supplies. Who'll give me $20 for the lot? Strong backs, they'll learn quick. The crowd murmured, shifted. $20 was a fortune. And for what? 3 foreign mouths to feed. The silence stretched, becoming an answer in itself. Barlow's face darkened. 10 then. $10. They're worth more than that in hide. Still nothing. A grim satisfaction began to curl Barlow's lip. He would show them what such property was worth when there were no buyers. He took a step toward the girls, his hand reaching for a whip coiled on the wagon seat. I'll take them. The voice was not loud. It was low and raspy, like it came from under floorboards. It cut through the thick, judgmental air with the clean shock of a winter axe. Every head turned. Elias pushed himself off the post, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at Barlow. His eyes were on the oldest girl. Barlow squinted. Miller? What use you got for him? Elias didn't answer the question. He walked past Barlow to the wagon, his steps even and unhurried. He pulled a small, worn leather pouch from his coat, untied the drawstring, and tipped out a few coins onto the flat head of a nearby rain barrel. There were 2 silver dollars and a handful of smaller coins. It wasn't a purchase. It was a statement. He was not buying them, he was settling a foulness. He walked to the girls, who flinched as his shadow fell over them. The oldest one stiffened, her body a rigid line of defiance, ready for a blow. Elias ignored Barlow's sputtering protests. He pulled a small, sharp pocket knife from his trousers. The blade clicked open, catching a sliver of sunlight. The girl's eyes widened, a flicker of new fear in their dark depths. He didn't speak. He reached out, his hand steady, and sawed through the thick rope binding her wrists. The fibers parted with a dry sigh. He moved to the next girl and the next, cutting the ropes that held them to the wagon post. He did not touch their skin. He kept a careful, respectful distance. When the last rope fell away, he folded his knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned and started walking out of town, not looking back to see if they would follow. He simply began the journey, trusting in the silent language of rescue. For a long moment, the three girls remained by the wagon, motionless. The oldest rubbed her raw wrist, her eyes fixed on the back of the man walking away. He was a stranger, another unknown in a world that had offered nothing but cruelty. But he had cut their ropes. The wind blew, lifting dust around their bare feet. She looked at her two sisters, their eyes wide and questioning. Then, making a choice that was her own, the first she had made in a long time, she took each of them by the hand. She followed him. The journey was a long, silent procession. Elias walked ahead, leading his weary horse, its saddlebags laden with the few supplies he'd come to town for. He did not set a fast pace. He seemed to measure it to the hesitant, shuffling steps of the small figures trailing him. The sun beat down, relentless. The land was vast and empty, a canvas of brown and ochre under a bleached blue sky. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts. An hour passed. Then another. The youngest girl began to stumble, her small legs giving out. The oldest sister, without a word, scooped her up, her thin frame straining under the weight. Elias heard the change in the rhythm of their footsteps. He stopped. He unhooked the canteen from his saddle. He walked back to them, his shadow falling over them again. The oldest girl tensed, shielding her sisters behind her. He held out the canteen. His eyes were not unkind, merely tired. She watched his hand for a long moment before she reached out and took it. Her fingers were small and cold against his calloused skin. She gave the water to her sisters first, tilting the heavy canteen carefully to their lips. Only then did she allow herself a small, cautious sip. She handed it back to him, her gaze dropping to the ground. It was the first kindness. A seed planted in barren soil. They arrived at his home as dusk was beginning to bruise the edges of the sky. The homestead was as stark and weathered as the man himself. A small, sturdy cabin of axe-hewn logs, a leaning barn, and a web of fences that looked like they were stitched together with hope and wire. The place was isolated, a tiny island in an ocean of prairie. It was clean, but it carried an air of emptiness, a hollowness that seemed to emanate from the very wood. Under a lone, gnarled cottonwood tree near the house, a small, weathered wooden cross stood over a mound of earth. Elias led them not to the barn, but to the front door of the cabin. He pushed it open. The inside was one room, Spartan and spare. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a bed built into the corner. A profound quiet lived within those walls. He gestured them inside. They hesitated on the threshold, clinging to one another. He didn't press. He walked over to a stack of clean, folded blankets on a shelf, relics of a different life. He laid them on the floor near the hearth, a good distance from his own bed. He filled a tin basin with water from a bucket by the door and set it beside the blankets. Then he took a half loaf of dark bread from a cupboard, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and placed it next to the basin. He looked at the oldest girl. Her eyes were dark pools, reflecting the fading light from the open door. He wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. They felt like stones in his mouth. So instead, he just gave a short, single nod. He turned, took a spare blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed, and walked outside to the covered porch. They heard the scrape of a chair, then silence. He was giving them the house. He had cut their ropes, and now he was showing them they were not in a new prison. The door remained unlocked. The first days fell into a rhythm of silent work. A language of action, not words. Elias rose before the sun, his movements quiet and contained. He would milk his single cow, mend a broken fence rail, chop wood. He moved with the steady, relentless pace of a man who knew that to stop moving was to let the ghosts in. Inside the cabin, the girls began to stir. Cautiously at first, they explored the small space that was their sanctuary. They found a broom and swept the floorboards until they were clean of every speck of dust. They washed the few dishes, stacked the firewood neatly by the hearth. They discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the house choked with weeds. The oldest girl, her sisters shadowing her every move, began to patiently, methodically pull the weeds. Her hands, already raw, became caked with dirt, but she worked with a singular focus. It was a piece of the earth she could bring back to life. It was a task that was hers. They never spoke to him. When he came in from his chores, they would retreat to their corner, a silent trio of shadows. But they would leave a bowl of water for him on the table. And when they learned to use the simple stove, they started cooking. Simple meals of reconstituted beans and the potatoes they unearthed from the garden. They would eat their portion, then leave a third plate on the hearth for him. Section he would come in, long after they were huddled under their blankets, and see the plate. The first time, he stood over it for a full minute, his shadow long and dark in the firelight. He ate every bite. The next morning, a small pail of fresh, warm milk was waiting for them on the porch. The day after that, 3 precious eggs. A silent conversation of giving and receiving began to thread itself through their days, stitching their broken lives together with these small, unspoken kindnesses. One afternoon, the oldest girl wandered over to the small grave under the cottonwood. The wooden cross was weathered gray, the name carved into it long since faded by sun and snow. She knelt, her movements slow and graceful, and began to pull the thistle and burrs that grew around the mound. She smoothed the earth with her bare hands. Then she stood and walked out onto the prairie, returning with a single, resilient yellow wildflower which she tucked into the earth at the base of the cross. Elias watched from the barn doorway, his hands clenched around the handle of a pitchfork. He felt a sharp, unexpected pang in his chest, a door opening onto a room he had kept locked for years. That was Mary's grave, and their infant son's. He had not been able to tend it himself for a long, long time. To see the strange, silent girl do it, it was like a hand reaching into his chest and gently touching the wound. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air catching in his throat. His knuckles turned white on the wood, then slowly, deliberately relaxed. That evening, when he came in, he found a folded, dark blue shawl lying on the back of one of the chairs. It was woolen, soft, and smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. It had been Mary's. He picked it up and walked over to where the girls were sitting. He held it out to the oldest. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She hesitated, then slowly reached out and took it. The wool was soft against her calloused fingers. She wrapped it around her shoulders, a shield of warmth against the coming night's chill. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you, a sharing of grief that needed no words. A week later, a sudden storm rolled in from the plains, the sky turning a bruised purple-black. The wind rose to a howl, rattling the single window in its frame. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting open. The 2 younger girls began to cry, their small bodies trembling with a terror that was old and deep. The oldest girl, May, though no one knew her name, gathered them into her arms, whispering to them in a language Elias didn't understand, her voice a low, soothing murmur. But the storm was too big, the house too small. Elias, who had been on the porch, pushed the door open and came inside. He didn't light a lamp. He went to the hearth and coaxed the embers back to life, adding logs until a warm, steady fire pushed back the encroaching shadows and the chill. He didn't speak. He simply pulled one of the heavy chairs closer to the fire and sat down, a solid, unmovable presence against the fury of the storm. He stared into the flames, his profile carved by the flickering light. May watched him. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the deep-set weariness in his face. He was not looking at them, but she knew he was there for them. The simple act of his presence was a bulwark. Slowly, the younger girls' sobs subsided into whimpers, then quiet hiccups. They fell asleep, curled against their sister, their faces still damp with tears. The storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, a pocket of peace had formed around the fire. May looked across the flickering space at Elias. Her eyes held a question, raw and direct. Why? Why are you doing this? He must have felt her gaze, because he turned his head and looked at her. He didn't offer a smile or a comforting word. He just held her gaze for a long moment, and then he gave a slow, single nod. It was an answer. Because it is right. Because I know what it is to be alone. In that shared silence, with the world raging outside, the first, fragile roots of trust began to take hold in the hard soil of their lives. The quiet rhythm of their lives held for weeks, a fragile truce with the harshness of the world. The garden began to flourish under the girls' patient care. The house felt less empty, the sound of the youngest girls humming, a thin, reedy tune, sometimes filled the corners. It was a sound of life returning. Elias found himself listening for it. The deep lines of grief around his eyes seemed to soften. He was still a quiet man, a man who lived behind a wall of his own making, but small cracks were beginning to appear. He'd taught May how to check his trap lines, her movements swift and sure. She'd learned to bake a passable loaf of bread, though her first attempt was a dense, smoky brick. He'd held it, turned it over in his hands, and said that loaf died in vain. A flicker of a smile had touched her lips before she could hide it. It was the closest they had come to a joke. The change was most visible in May. The rigid posture had eased. The haunted, vacant look in her eyes had been replaced by a watchful intelligence. She was still quiet, but her silence was no longer born of pure terror. It was the silence of an observer, of someone learning the contours of a new and uncertain peace. She moved with a newfound purpose, her protection of her sisters no longer just a desperate instinct, but a confident daily practice. The peace was broken on a Tuesday. The air was still and hot, the sun a white fire in the sky. Elias was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar heartbeat on the homestead. May was hanging washed clothes on a line stretched between the house and the cottonwood tree. It was then that she saw it. A plume of dust on the far horizon. It was not the lazy drift of a lone rider. It was thick and purposeful. It was coming toward them. She froze, a wet shirt clutched in her hand, the water dripping unheeded onto the parched earth. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She had seen a plume of dust like that once before. Elias saw it too. He lowered his axe, his body going still. He watched the approaching dust for a long moment, his face hardening back into the grim mask it had worn when he'd first found them. He didn't need to be told. Trouble had a way of finding its way back. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward the house. "Get your sisters," he said, his voice low and flat. "Go inside. Stay away from the window." May didn't hesitate. She gathered her sisters, their small hands clutching her dress, and herded them into the cabin. She pulled them into the corner by the hearth, the corner that had become their safe place, and wrapped her arms around them. Through a crack in the door, she watched as Elias emerged from the cabin. His old hunting rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He didn't look like a man spoiling for a fight. He looked like a man preparing to hold a line. 3 riders crested the low rise and slowed their horses, their arrogance poisoning the air. The man in the middle was Barlow, his face flushed with heat and cheap liquor. He grinned, a humorless baring of teeth, as he saw Elias standing there. "Miller," Barlow called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. He stopped his horse just outside the rickety fence line, treating it as a formal border. "I've come for my property." Elias didn't move. He stood on his porch, a solitary, unyielding figure. "They ain't property," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the land. "They're people. And they're on my land now." Barlow chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Are they? I have a bill of sale. Says 3 Chinese girls, payment for a debt. That's legal. That's binding. You interfered in a business transaction, Miller. Now step aside." He started to swing his leg over his saddle, his hand resting on the pistol holstered at his hip. "I said no." The words were quiet, but they were final. They were a wall of stone. Inside the cabin, May watched, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw Barlow's hand go to his gun. She saw the cold, murderous intent in his eyes. A terror, cold and familiar, seized her. It was the terror of helplessness, of being a thing to be taken, to be used, to be discarded. It was the feeling that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. But then something else rose up to meet it. The memory of a soft shawl. The taste of fresh milk. The feel of a solid, quiet presence sitting with her through a storm. The sight of a man standing alone, with only a rifle and his word between her and the whole cruel world. It was a fire, small at first, but it burned away the cold. Barlow took a step toward the porch. "I ain't asking again, old man." At that moment, the cabin door creaked open. Elias didn't turn. He knew. He felt it. May stepped out onto the porch and stood just behind his shoulder. Her face was pale, her eyes enormous in her thin face. But they were not the eyes of a victim. They were blazing with a cold, hard fire. In her hands, she held the heavy, black cast-iron skillet. She held it not like a cooking implement, but like a shield or a weapon. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the handle. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence was a declaration. "You will not take us. Not again." The 2 younger girls appeared in the doorway behind her, their small faces pressed against the back of her dress, their hands clutching the fabric. They were a single, unified front. A family forged in silence and work and shared bread. Barlow stopped dead. He stared from the stoic, immovable man with the rifle to the fierce, silent girl with the skillet. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the way she stood beside Elias, not as a possession to be protected, but as a partner in defiance. He saw in their silent unity something he could not break with threats, something his bullets couldn't kill. It was a kind of strength he didn't understand, and it unnerved him. He hesitated, his bluster failing him. His 2 men shifted uneasily in their saddles, looking from Barlow to the silent tableau on the porch. This wasn't the easy reclamation they had been promised. Barlow's face contorted in a sneer to cover his sudden uncertainty. He spat into the dust at his feet. "This ain't over, Miller," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. The fire had gone out of it. He turned without another word, swung himself back onto his horse, and yanked the reins viciously. He kicked the animal into a gallop and rode away, his men scrambling to follow. Their retreat was hurried, almost shameful. The cloud of dust they raised slowly drifted away, and the profound silence of the prairie returned. Elias stood unmoving until they were nothing but a speck on the horizon. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, the tension draining from his shoulders. He lowered the rifle. He turned. May was still standing there, the heavy skillet clutched in her hands. She was trembling, the aftermath of adrenaline and fear shaking her slender frame. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently take the cast iron from her grasp. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second. It was the first time they had truly touched. A current, warm and electric, passed between them. The skillet felt impossibly heavy in his hand. "I was scared," she said. Her voice was a thin whisper, fragile as a bird's wing. It was the first time she had spoken to him of her own feelings. Elias looked at her, at the fierce loyalty burning in her eyes, at the strength that had risen from the ashes of her past. "I know," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. He looked from her to her sisters, huddled in the doorway. "You didn't run." She met his gaze, and for the first time, a small, weary smile touched her lips. "This is home," she whispered. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer a space between strangers, but a comfortable quiet shared by a family. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. The two younger girls were already asleep, nestled together under the blankets, their faces peaceful. Elias sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical movements. May sat across from him, mending a tear in her sister's dress, the blue shawl he had given her draped around her shoulders. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the residue of the day's fear and the profound relief of its aftermath. He finished with the rifle, setting it carefully aside. He looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the sharp line of her cheekbone, the fierce concentration in her eyes as she worked the needle. She was no longer just a survivor he had taken in. She had become something more. A pillar of this new life they were building. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low in the quiet room. She stopped her sewing and looked up, surprised by the directness of the question. They had lived together for months, spoken a language of gestures and actions, but had never crossed the simple, human threshold. She lowered her gaze to her hands resting in her lap. "I am called May," she said, her voice soft but clear. She gestured with her head toward the sleeping forms by the fire. "They are in India." He nodded slowly, tasting the names on his tongue. May. India. They were real. They were not just the girls, they had names. They had identities. It was a key turning in a lock. "Elias," he said. It felt strange to say his own name aloud. It felt like an offering. The act of naming them, of being named in return, solidified everything. It was a quiet declaration. It was the laying of a foundation stone. The next morning, while the girls were outside, Elias walked to the mantelpiece above the hearth. He took down the small, faded tin-type photograph that had sat there for 5 years. It was a portrait of him and Mary taken on their wedding day. He was stiff and uncomfortable in a borrowed suit. She was smiling, her eyes full of a light he thought had been extinguished from the world forever. He stared at it for a long time, tracing the outline of her face with his thumb. Then he wrapped it carefully in a piece of soft buckskin and placed it inside the heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He was not erasing his past. He was not forgetting her. He was making room. When May came back inside, she noticed the empty space on the mantel. She looked at it, then at Elias. She saw the quiet grief and acceptance in his eyes. She said nothing. Later that afternoon, she came in from the prairie holding a small, intricate braid she had woven from sweetgrass and the tough, colorful threads of wildflowers. With a quiet reverence, she hung it on a nail on the wall, not where the picture had been, but near it. A new adornment. A new memory being made. A splash of color in a world of brown and gray. The house, for the first time, breathed again. It was no longer just his house of grief or their temporary shelter. It was becoming a home. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The wind turned cold, carrying the first hints of snow. The routine of their lives deepened, became less a matter of survival and more a pattern of belonging. In Ngia's laughter became a common sound in the yard, their fear replaced by the simple, boundless joy of childhood. They chased the chickens, their cheeks red from the cold. They would run to Elias when he came in from the fields, unafraid, and tug on his coat. He had taught May how to shoot the rifle. Not for hunting, but for protection. A person should know how to hold their own ground. he told her, his hands guiding hers to show her how to brace it against her shoulder. She was a natural shot, steady and calm. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall in fat, silent flakes outside the window, he was carving a piece of wood by the fire. He was making small animals for the girls. A lopsided horse for In, a smooth, rounded bird for Ja. May sat beside him, reading from a worn primer he had found for her in the chest, her finger tracing the letters. Her English was still halting, but her desire to learn was a fire in itself. He finished the small wooden bird and held it out to her. "For you," he said. She took it, her fingers closing around the smooth, warm wood. It was a bird with its wings outstretched, ready for flight. She looked at it, then up at him, and her eyes were shining in the firelight. In that moment, the space between them, once a vast and silent canyon, was no bigger than the palm of her hand. He saw not just a survivor, not just a protector of her sisters, but a woman of incredible strength and quiet grace. He had taken in 3 lost children, thinking he was offering them shelter, but it was May who had truly rescued him. She had walked into the barren winter of his life and taught him how to live again. She had stolen the grief right out of his soul and replaced it with a fragile, fierce hope. Weeks later, the snow lay thick and white upon the land, muffling the world in a blanket of peace. Elias had built a porch swing, and even in the cold, he and May would sometimes sit there, wrapped in blankets, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered plains in hues of rose and violet. And Njia played nearby, their laughter muffled by the snow, leaving trails of small footprints like stitches in the white fabric. May came out of the house carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She handed one to him, and their hands touched. This time, neither of them pulled away. They sat together in the comfortable silence that had become their truest language, watching the 2 little girls who were their shared heart, their shared future. The house behind them was warm, its windows glowing with light. It was no longer a hollow shelter against the wilderness. It was a home filled to the brim with a life he never thought he would have again. He looked at May, at the soft smile on her lips, and knew he had found his place. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. This story, you see, it ain't just about rescue. Any man with a coin and a conscience can cut a rope. That's the easy part. The hard part is what comes after. It's the quiet work of building a home, not with timber and nails, but with shared silence, with warm bread left on a hearth, with the courage to stand together when the wolves come back to the door. We all have ropes that bind us, ropes of sorrow, of fear, of a past that tells us we are worthless. And maybe we wait for someone to come along and cut them. But the real healing, the real rebirth, it happens in the small gestures that follow. It's in the tending of a forgotten garden. It's in the giving of a name and the courage to say your own in return. So here's your naming. You are not the things that were done to you. You are not the price you were sold for. You are the person who learns to stand on their own patch of earth, hold a skillet or a rifle or just a steady gaze, and say, "This is my home. This is my life." You are the one who finds a small, wild hope and plants it at the foot of an old grave, trusting it will grow. And if you're brave enough, if you're quiet enough to listen, you might just find that in saving someone else, the person you truly rescue is yourself. You might find that the soul you thought was lost forever wasn't stolen at all. It was just waiting for a reason to come home.